Chapter 7, Imploding. Cowtails, an unlovable blend of darkness and light. Once upon a time, there was a girl floating on her back in the sea. The hands were still threatening to drag her down into the dark, oily water, and the girl didn't see the point in fighting anymore. So she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes and continued to float, and her mind floated with her. She felt the water lapping against her body, and she couldn't help thinking about what was in it. Salt, of course. Births and deaths, no doubt. Semen for sure. Blood. Yeah, plenty of blood. The girl didn't want to think anymore, so she started singing softly to herself. Her lips rose and fell into the dark waves, and she barely tasted the water when it invaded her mouth as the thick sea cradled her. Feeling complacent for the moment, the girl widened her legs and allowed the black water that was a mixture of life and death to float in and out, carrying her closer towards sleep. When I was a kid, my elementary school would have a fundraiser. Unlike today, when kids sell outrageously priced popular candies such as Reese's and Hershey bars, I was forced to sell outrageously priced cowtails. Now, my man God, you might well be thinking, what the hell's a cowtail? That's what any normal human would wonder. Ultimately, they are sticks of shit with white cum inside. Though that might be too mild of a description. They are comparable to Marmite in England in that they are definitely an acquired taste. People either love them or they hate them. There is no in between. As you can well imagine, selling them was no small feat. Why am I telling you this? Because for a long time, and still sometimes even now, I am both a cowtail and a failed cowtail salesman. With that being said, let's dive right into some more loveliness that you should be aware of. Though this time let's zero in on some that are very directly linked to the trauma I endured at the hands and other parts of my molester. This first flaw is interesting, as it involves something I don't fully understand myself, though I am guilty of it. I wanted to rape people. Yeah, sounds terrible, I know, but it's true. If it makes you feel any better, I never did actually rape or even attempt to rape anyone. Like most things, all the raping occurred in my head. Most people, I'm sure, would wonder how I could possibly even think of doing this to someone else when I know how badly it hurts. That's not a bad inquiry, but I don't know the answer to it. I had looked it up before to see what psychology has to say about this phenomenon. The main conclusion drawn from such research was that it's a power thing. Maybe it is. But that didn't seem like a complete enough answer to me, so I made a list of possibilities of my own that goes something like this. 1. You're trying to make sense of why it happened to you in the first place. 2. You're envious of anyone who's allowed to skip through life while you were forced to crawl on your bare stomach through glass just to make it through another day. 3. The perpetrator leaves a bit of himself inside you that wants to manifest in the physical world. 4. You don't feel worthy enough to have a healthy relationship, so you have to force someone else to love you. 5. You want to drag someone into hell with you so that you aren't alone anymore. Or 6. You're just plain horny. Regardless of the reason, the bottom line is I still fantasized about being the rapist. And I have to give myself credit where credit is due. My victim was typically always a full-grown, though sometimes just barely legal, woman, not a child. At least I wasn't that sick. Most of the time, the fantasy never took logistics into account, as in how anything came to be, because that was never the fun part to think about. Instead, my fantasies always went something like this. She would always be strapped to a table. Her eyes would be the only part of her that was covered. She'd be knocked out cold. I'd already be prepared, calm, and waiting for her. When she awoke, it'd take her a few seconds to realize that she was blind, a few more to realize that she couldn't go anywhere, another few to realize she was naked, and then jump and a skip more to realize she was being watched. She'd fruitlessly try to cover herself from my gaze, and I would delight in her struggles. Then we'd get to the fun part, the touching. Normally I'd start by hovering my hands over her body, letting her feel me before any skin-to-skin contact occurred. It feels more personal that way, and it lets the victim know that my eyes aren't the only things close to her. By allowing her to feel my presence, we were establishing a connection, whether she wanted it or not. I also had a weird thing where I didn't want to get caught in my imaginary world, and murdering her was out of the question. I couldn't bring myself to do that, even in my head. But if I wanted to rape someone in real life, how could I not get caught? My solution? I would pretend I was a man. That doesn't mean that I actually imagined that I was a man. On the contrary, I was always myself, just in the buff, and oh so ready to do something stupid. I would use props, like gloves and dildos, feel free to use your imagination here, to fool my blindfolded victim into believing that she was getting attacked by a man rather than a woman. I figured that in all likelihood, most people would assume that a man would attack a woman sexually, not that another woman would do it to a fellow woman. It sort of gave me a weird thrill to fool the world like that. But as inevitably always happened, I would very quickly feel like I was lying to myself. I would then just want to let my freak flab fly and do it raw and nastily, which is what would always end up happening. I guess you could say it was a happy ending for me, though it was a questionably happy ending for my imaginary tied-up chick. Sometimes she would cry, and if I was feeling particularly callous that day, I'd enjoy that immensely, even maniacally. However, there were other times when I would just ignore her face and focus solely on her body. It was as if she was just a doll, soulless but fully available for me to play with. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Using someone's body as a plaything, not caring to inflict harm, discomfort, to watch someone's soul get crushed under the weight of your cruelty and fly out of her mouth as a scream, a cry, a whimper. To see the light go out and watch her voice get lodged in her throat. To see her become a corpse under your hands. To notice her start to look like you. It's exhilarating and deadening all at once. But no matter how many fantasies I had, it was never enough. You can get stuck in your own head, you know. You can choose to be imprisoned in your own mind, cushioned in a padded cell, just because you don't like the cage around you in real life. Once you allow yourself a peek through your physical eyes, your muscles could be sore and the day could be done. And although thoughts and actions are linked, it takes a lot of willpower to move from thoughts into physical actions, which is one of the reasons why I never raped or tried to rape anyone. But that doesn't mean that something physical never came out of these mental rapes. Naturally, masturbation would frequently accompany these sessions instead. But masturbation in and of itself is not necessarily the issue, though I felt at the time that it was. When I would masturbate, I had to hold the reins on my body, with varying degrees of success. After a session, I would feel instant shame. I'd beg God to forgive me for my weakness, all the while feeling the pushing in the back of my brain, urging me on and knowing with certainty that I would do it again. Shame is the ultimate buzzkill in the midst of masturbating. Sometimes I would just keep on doing it, pushing through the shame. My brain would shut off and I desperately tried to feel again, though I sometimes just did it out of defiance of my fickle libido. I guess a lot of the time I was similar to a cutter, though I didn't slit my wrists or poke holes into my skin, but I would poke and rub and explore something else in order to feel. Often, I wouldn't fully commit to masturbating. I'd hold back and barely touch myself. I felt too awkward and it felt wrong. Many times I would get mad after masturbating or failing to properly masturbate. It was unhealthy masturbating, and no, masturbation isn't always unhealthy. I didn't have a good relationship with myself, so the sex was bad. The desperation would oftentimes lure me into the vulgar. I would masturbate when others were around. Sometimes under a blanket, sometimes with just a little touch here, a little touch there, and I would feel shame, fear, smoke pride, and something that felt like happiness all at once each time I wasn't caught. I knew that habit can manifest in reality without you consciously knowing it. So I'd be afraid that I would accidentally squeeze my breasts in public or rub my crotch absent-mindedly because I had the muscle memory in place from so many repeated and needed sessions. That kind of damage to your rep could really shred you, especially when you aren't feeling horny that day. If you are horny, screw the world and yourself. Caring kind of goes out the window at that stage in the game. Masturbation did serve a more useful function. It helped me learn more about my physical body and sexual reactions. The overall sex knowledge that I gleaned from it, though, was limited. Being sexually violated doesn't mean that the victim understands sex. It especially if that victim was as young as I was. So curiosity about sex and sexual impulses, motivations, and actions was a very real urge. Naturally, the internet, which mainly boils down to the pimp of sex education, pornography, proved to be a bit more enlightening than masturbation alone. Now, I was not very tech savvy back then, so my tech disability, along with a very slow internet connection, would occasionally cause a dent in my education. The screen would often freeze, and it was always during a particularly obvious sex scene. In other words, it wouldn't freeze on someone's face or freeze in the beginning of the video when people are typically fully clothed. It would freeze right in the middle of a steamy scene that is undeniably porn, as if the computer itself couldn't take that much action in one sitting. In those moments, my heart would feel like it burst, causing blood to splatter and pool in my chest. In a frenzied panic, I would slam the on-off button with my finger to emergency shut down the system, and I'd fervently pray to God, Allah, and Yahweh himself that the site wouldn't show up on the screen when I turned the computer back on. Thankfully, it never did. I guess the computer couldn't take that level of steam twice. Other times, I would click on a video, and the volume would blast for half a second until I exited out in a hurry. I would thank God, Allah, and Yahweh again for me miraculously not getting caught, vowing that I'd give up my self-destructive and sinful behavior forever. And I actually would give it up, at least for a few short weeks. Deep down though, even as I promised that I wouldn't, I knew that I just couldn't stop for good. I would also do things that mimicked my past experience. I would drape a towel on the floor in the bathroom, run my hands up and down my body, open my legs, and explore. I'd even imagine me getting molested all over again. And this time, deadened and weakened, I didn't mind. Although I yearned for physical intimacy, I never tried to have sex with anyone. I couldn't bring myself to do it, partially because of my strict Roman Catholic upbringing that frowned upon such things before marriage, but also because I struggled to develop deep enough bonds for that. Despite the orgies in my head, I wanted a soul connection with a man before I got physical with him. Few males looked at me with love anyway. Unfortunately for my young self, creepy old men tended to look at me most, and their eyes were definitely not filled with love. Their looks would repulse me. Whenever anything feels remotely dirty like that to me, my vagina physically feels like it is being ripped apart with dirty searching fingers that rub the walls of my vagina raw. My poor vagina would end up feeling too open, exposed, unprotected, and vulnerable. I don't know how that's possible, but it does feel as disgusting as it sounds. Logically, you'd think that I'd be repulsed by every old man I ever saw, but oddly enough, they figured prominently in my fantasies. When I wasn't alone, most of my time was spent with women. I very rarely interacted with men, so men were very much a mystery to me, and I just didn't feel worthy of being with a beautiful young man. It made me feel self-conscious and inadequate. So instead, I latched onto the ones who made me ridiculously uncomfortable in real life, but who I knew would be attached to me because I was young. Now, I do realize that youth doesn't last forever if you live long enough to grow old, but my fantasies could be whatever I wanted them to be, and I would use those creepy-ass old men to my advantage. There was one specific fantasy that involved my getting kidnapped. I do have to say that I often thought of getting kidnapped. I'm such a stress ball, but I was too cowardly to take myself away from the stressors or to handle my stressors head on. So I figured that getting stolen would allow me to get away from the stressors of now, but it technically wouldn't be my fault that it was stolen. So there was never any guilt involved. I had watched a true crime show where one of the episodes mentioned that young women would be kidnapped by this old man who kept them in his basement. He would rape them while living his normal life with his wife upstairs. But after a certain amount of time, he'd always let his basement victims go. He never killed them. I have to say that despite his crimes, I respect him for not killing them. Although rape kills you in a way, it can be temporary. There is a way to be resurrected physically in this world again. When you actually die, who knows? You may return, but not in the form you are in now, or you may never return. I don't know how that works, but at least they didn't need to find that out right away. That particular crime inspired the old men fantasies quite a bit. I would imagine getting stolen and taken to an old man's basement. I wouldn't take into account any privation. I'd always have him be very accommodating, so I was always able to take a shower, to go to a real bathroom, etc. Inconveniences just don't appeal to me. In my head, as I've mentioned before, I would always be bold and confident. So when the old man stole me and I woke up in his basement nude, I'd come towards him and actually engage in consensual sex rather than getting raped. I feel like the old man stealing me was thought up after my rapist fantasy. Because consensual sex occurred rather than rape, maybe that meant my messed up mind was on the mend. Though I couldn't let myself heal too much, I needed to be more extreme, and I couldn't bear to leave out the self-sabotage. I've always been afraid of pregnancy for a long time. What it does to a woman's body is unreal. The pain, the inevitability of it, knowing that that baby has to come out in some way at some time, freaks me out to no end. There's so much more to my pregnancy fears than that, but that's the gist. Of course, pregnancy had to be featured in my fantasies as well. You can't properly self-sabotage unless you stick in some good fears. The old man then would eventually get me pregnant. That didn't stop the sex by any means, but it did up the kink. Occasionally, I let my mind get to the birthing bits. This old man would conveniently be a doctor and be able to help me deliver the baby safely straight from the basement. I'd even sometimes get to go upstairs when his wife wasn't home. How sad for his poor wife and for me and the imaginary child. Even more so than the old man fantasies, lesbianism featured prominently in my head. I don't know if it's because I was always around women and they weren't the ones who touched me and took away my hard-won Disney fork and destroyed my pretty, ugly sundress, but I feel more comfortable looking at and thinking about having sex with women. Plus, a woman can't get you pregnant, which was a huge plus. Although why a woman was my chosen mental rape victim is beyond me. Maybe my knowing so little of men made them seem untouchable. And I knew enough about women to know how to make them break. Maybe it's because women are usually the ones people expect to be rape victims. I'm not sure. Though after the old men fantasies came into play, the lesbianism in my head turned away from rape and became consensual love instead. Once again, my head might actually somehow had been on the mend. I highly doubt I'm the only one who's had sick fantasies. Pornography, prostitution, strip clubs, none of that would exist if people didn't have some strange kinks in their head that they wanted to play out in real life. I just happened to take many taboos and fears and play them in my head so often that I was breaking myself down. I can assure you that no one else was hurt in the making of my mental fantasies. Although the sex and raping happened in my head, I would have moments when I was so ridiculously horny and lonely, I would look for trouble where I could find it. Craigslist used to have a personal section where you could find someone to use for no strings attached sex. I would frequently look through those personals to find people, both old men and young middle-aged women, nearby. I would look at their pictures and read what they wanted in a quick sex partner. Most of the descriptions never fit me, and most people were way too picky for my taste, but I seriously considered reaching out to some of them. Sometimes I debated about doing some type of call girl or video chat prostitution, because that would mean that I didn't physically have to be with anyone, but I could still get my kinks out. Yup, I was that far gone. Naturally, me being me, I never did reach out to anyone or try being a prostitute, but there were moments when I was so close. One more straw on my back and it actually could have happened. I was aware even then and do know now that I contributed greatly to the looping of my own hell. I urge you to expect greatness from this quarter anyway. As long as you can get past the ugly, beauty must be in there somewhere.